All right, we have a little over 100 people in now, so whenever
I can get started?
Yeah, whenever you guys
Okay.
want to get going, go for it, Tom.
Yeah, I'll go. Hi, I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program at the School of International Studies at School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. And we're having an event today that's co-hosted by the Weatherhead Center at SIPA and at Columbia University. And we really welcome all of you. A lot of you signed up for this event and we maxed out. I apologize for those of you who were unable to come in. If you know people like that, please apologize for us. There's a limit based on our server at Columbia. We have a special event today to talk about the new Biden administration and our views on US-China relations moving forward with the new administration in place. This is our first event at China and the World for the spring semester. And I wanted to thank our funders, the Carnegie Corporation. I see Steve Del Rosso has joined us, and we get very generous support from them. And this is the kind of public outreach that we try to do each semester. Today we have a panel of 3 people, including myself. And I want to introduce the other 2 panelists. One is Professor Andy Nathan. Andy is familiar to all the people at Columbia. He's probably familiar to the other people who've joined us today. He's a leading expert on Chinese domestic politics and comparative politics. He's a leading expert on China's foreign policy. He's also an authority on comparative authoritarianism around the world and on international relations related to human rights. The second panelist is our guest today, Bonnie Glaser. We're really honored that she joined us. Bonnie has been a leading expert on Asian security matters and on China's security policy for quite a long time. She, in the 1990s, when I started working on these issues, she was a leading consultant for the State Department and the Defense Department. And more recently, she's worked as a senior scholar at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And she's the director of a very important project there called the China Power Project. And I really welcome the audience to visit the website for the China Power Project at CSIS. It's full of useful information. And she remains one of the nation's leading experts on these topics. And has been a longtime friend of mine. And I was just thrilled when she quickly said yes when I invited her for this event, because I can't really think of a more authoritative voice than Bonnie. And the way we're going to proceed today, in the tradition of the School of International and Public Affairs, is we're going to have our speakers speak relatively briefly so that we can have a good exchange with the audience. Andy Nathan will speak first on some issues related to human rights and US-China relations moving forward. Bonnie Glaser will speak about some security issues in the US-China relationship. And I will finish up with some thoughts about the broader environment of US-China relations, including some of the security issues touched upon by Bonnie. And we should have quite a bit of time for the audience. I asked the audience to use the chat function for the questions. So that my associate director, Daniel Sahensky, can field the questions for the panelists. And we'll look forward to a robust discussion. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Andy Nathan, a leading professor at Columbia, who has the somewhat dubious distinction of also having been my advisor for my PhD at Columbia University. Andy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom. So I've been, as probably many of you know, I've been doing sort of China human rights for a long time. And for a very long time, the human rights issue was on the margins of American China policy. It was an inconvenience for administrations to have to feed it into their more important dealings with China on real issues. So there was a kind of ethical obligation from time to find some way to complain to the Chinese government about human rights violations. President George H.W. Bush was kind of forced to do so publicly and lead in G7 sanctions on China after 1989. George W. Bush said that he preferred to do it privately by looking Hu Jintao in the eye. He said, I looked him in the eye and I could see sincerity and religion in there. But my sense is that in the last few years, human rights has emerged as central to the emerging strategic competition between the United States and China, not only because members of the Trump administration have, in my opinion, used freedom of religion issues and other human rights issues in a rather cynical way for domestic political purposes, but rather because both China and the United States have begun to construe their strategic competition as a broad clash of values and systems. And for that reason, the human rights issue has kind of grown. It's no longer only human rights. It has grown and has become a kind of conceptual umbrella for the relationship. It's no longer a relationship about economic competition as such, for example. That economic competition is understood as a competition over what type of economic system is fair, what type of international trade and financial system is fair and consistent with each side's interpretation of international law. The US-China strategic competition certainly is in part a military competition, but again, it's couched very much in terms of which side is fair. Does the United States have a right to be in Taiwan? Is China violating international law and showing itself to be a lawless power as it occupies and builds sand islands and extends its control over the South China Sea, for example? So I think the strategic competition is not seen in merely realist terms, but it's seen in terms of some kind of existential battle over the underlying norms of the world order. So you have quotation, for example, Evan Osnos in the New Yorker quoted Newt Gingrich to the effect that, and this is not an exact quote, I have it in my notes, but that, the rise of China represents the most severe threat to Western civilization, worse than the Nazis, worse than Stalin, that kind of thing. Now that's an extreme point of view, although that extreme point of view was articulated in various forms not by Trump himself, but by members of the Trump administration. But I think in the sort of mainstream view of China, it's also a view over China's articulation of a competing model that's founded on a competing set of values. Now, this view of things is actually there on both sides, I would say. So from a purely realist lens, one could say that as China's economy has grown and they've invested more in their military capability, they naturally threaten the incumbent privileges of the United States, whether that's military dominance in the Western Pacific or the reigning function of the dollar in the international system and stuff like that, and that it's a competition in that sense. But on the Chinese side, the Chinese government has long believed, and with some reason, that the United States-led Western countries are antagonistic to the very Chinese form of government and to the rise of China as such, and that in short, that we are trying to subvert them, do subversion to overthrow the regime. So when the Chinese government said that the disorder in Hong Kong was caused by the National Endowment for Democracy, although that's ridiculous, I think it really reflects a belief that they have, that their enemies are out to get them, and they have a lot of enemies, in their opinion, led by the United States, and that we just don't accept their system. So they see themselves, I think, struggling not so much to install a Chinese type system in, Germany or Greece or Zimbabwe or the United States, but as really defending the legitimacy of their system from what they see as an ideologically oriented, racially and ideologically motivated attack. And on the United States side as well, I think it's not only the expansion of Chinese power and the propensity of the United States to see all threats to our domination as civilizational threats, but it is also the fact that the Chinese, in trying to defend the legitimacy of their own system, have extended a certain amount of cultural influence and some amount of cultural censorship over us. So the Confucius Institutes and the influence of China over Hollywood and the apology by Marriott hotels and those kinds of things, which to some extent are relatively smallish incidents in a certain optic, have gotten a huge amount of attention as a kind of attempt by China to interfere in our sort of God-given freedoms on this side of the water. So the strategic or the hard power competition has intersected with, on both sides, a sort of civilizational / ideological anxiety, or maybe one even wants to use the word hysteria. And of course, added on to this is the fact that the Xi Jinping regime has engaged in human rights violations that are more larger in scale and more blatant and impossible to ignore in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang in particular, but also the crackdown on Christianity, the crackdown on lawyers, the crackdown on feminists, and things going on in Tibet, which recently have gotten less attention, but very similar to what's going on in Xinjiang and predated it, right? Because those policies were rolled out in Tibet first. These things are real, although the Chinese government argues otherwise. They are, I think the consensus in the West is that these are real and large human rights violations. So this problem is not going to go away. Neither the crackdown in China nor the revulsion against it in the United States is going to go away. And all of the policy advice that I've seen that's been published by different groups in the United States for the incoming Biden administration gives significant attention, in varying degrees, but significant attention to the importance of the human rights agenda in the American policy toward China. And the people who are going into the administration who are going to be doing China so far as we know, Kurt Campbell, Julian Gewirtz and others, I think from what I know of them, they're of course very sophisticated and subtle and nuanced and multidimensional policymakers, but they do consider the human rights agenda to be pretty important. So I think it's going to continue to be an important area for explaining China policy to the American people and for actually doing China policy. However, and this is to segue into my last section of my short remarks, I don't think people are calling it a new Cold War, but I think that in many important ways, it may be a new Cold War, but the new Cold War is different from the old Cold War in some important ways. One was that the Soviet Union claimed to want to install Soviet-style communism all over the world. The Chinese government has not, to my knowledge, articulated that kind of an ambition. And I don't think they see an interest in it either. I think they feel that what they want is for us to leave their system alone and for other countries to respect their core interests, which of course include a number of things that violate our core interests, like Taiwan, and their political system. So I don't think it's quite the same ideological struggle. I also think the elements of interdependence between us and the Chinese are enormously greater than they ever were with the Soviet Union. not only because of the intense economic relationship, also the intense cultural / educational relationship and the emergence of global challenges that cannot be handled without cooperation between the two sides. So I'll just conclude by saying that I think the human rights agenda, both in its very broad sense of a competition of systems and in its more specific sense of American pressure on China for particular identifiable, strictly speaking, human rights violations, is going to be quite central to the relationship, but it will not be the whole relationship. And I think I can stop there and kick it over to Bonnie.
So thank you, Tom and Andy, both a privilege to be on the panel with you and talk about U.S.-China relations. It's wonderful to join your fantastic China in the World program, Tom. So thanks again for having me. Security issues are likely to be at the front and center in the U.S.-China relationship. And the most dangerous flashpoints, I think, are those issues that pertain to Chinese sovereignty and intersect with important US interests. Domestic drivers in both Beijing and Washington are such that the leaders in both the United States and China want to avoid showing weakness and want to demonstrate resolve. Xi Jinping has been consistently quite tough on sovereignty matters. Back in 2018, when Jim Mattis was Secretary of Defense, Xi Jinping told him that China would not give up an inch of Chinese territory. And I think Xi Jinping will be especially vigilant about protecting Chinese interests on sovereignty issues in the next few years. And I say that because this year, 2021, is the centenary anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Next year is a very crucial National Party Congress, where Xi Jinping will likely get an unprecedented third term as General Secretary of the party. And he will want to shore up his bona fides as a staunch protector of Chinese sovereignty on issues like the South China Sea, the Sino-Indian border, the Sen Caucasus in the East China Sea, and of course, Taiwan. President Biden wants to demonstrate to Congress that he will hold China's feet to the fire on a very broad range of issues. And the Biden administration, I think, is mindful that China tried to take advantage of the Obama administration. And President Obama, early on in his first term, had emphasized that there is no global problem that can be solved without China's participation. And this was also the onset of the global financial crisis, a time when China drew the conclusion that the United States was in relative decline and China's rise was going to accelerate, thus narrowing the gap in the US-China balance of power. And that balance of power assessment, I would argue, this is of course what used to be called the correlation of forces by the former Soviet Union. This is one of the most critical factors shaping Chinese foreign policy calculus. When the balance of power is deemed to be in China's favor, I think China behaves more assertively. And I think we see that today. If you read speeches by senior experts at the party school, also officials, and even speeches by Xi Jinping, people are referencing the pandemic as having led to an acceleration of these trends in the balance of power that are in China's favor. And there's this new catchphrase in China: the East is rising, the West is declining. So this assessment, I think, creates the potential for miscalculation and escalation. I think the Biden administration is quite keen to signal early on that it will stand up for US interests, that it won't be taken advantage of. And over time, of course, President Biden wants to rejuvenate American power for many reasons, of course, but importantly, to compete more effectively with China, to deter Chinese aggression and challenges to US interests, and to avoid crises and war. So I'm going to talk a little bit greater detail about two prominent security flashpoints in the US-China relationship, Taiwan and the South China Sea. There's been a dangerous dynamic in US-China-Taiwan relations over the last few years. The election of Tsai Ing-wen, who of course is from the Democratic People's Progressive Party in 2016, and her unwillingness to embrace Beijing's One China principle and China's persistent rigid stance in reaction to that resulted in a real serious downturn in cross-strait relations. And China has been using many gray zone tactics, measures that are calculated to impose pressure but not provoke a military response from the United States. So the United States has a strong interest in Taiwan's security and also in the US credibility in the broader region that is connected to its willingness to stand up for Taiwan. And the Trump administration strengthened ties with Taipei in many ways, sometimes in a very confrontational ways, and very publicly, and even used at times Taiwan as a weapon in its relationship with China. So President Biden inherits this situation. We have seen this dynamic continue in the very first week of the Biden administration. China has, again, using these gray zone tactics, flown dozens of fighters and nuclear-capable bombers in international airspace near Taiwan. The State Department issued a very firm statement of support for Taiwan, not really very dissimilar from the kind of dynamics we saw in the Trump administration. So will tensions continue to ratchet up? I expect that they will, in part for the reasons that I outlined earlier. The risks of a crisis, I think, are growing. However, my own view is that it is unlikely that the PRC will use military force against Taiwan as not in the full-scale invasion sense. There is certainly a risk of smaller scale use of force. But my read of Chinese policy statements is that reunification is not an urgent Chinese goal, and Beijing still remains relatively confident that Taiwan cannot become a de jure sovereign state, and China's urgent goal is to deter independence, which I believe essentially they've achieved. But it's going to be very rocky going ahead, especially with the potential for referendum being held in Taiwan over the course of the next couple of years. The South China Sea is another security issue that I think will continue to be very fraught under the Biden administration. I expect that the United States will continue the high pace of freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, as well as an active program of reconnaissance and surveillance, which China has always objected very strongly to. One question mark, I think, in South China Sea policy is whether President Biden will continue the Trump policy of standing up for the rights of smaller claimants to fish and develop oil and gas within their exclusive economic zones and on their continental shelves. That was a new direction of policy beginning this past July. And that policy has been welcomed by Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And walking away from it might be harmful to the US position with those Southeast Asian states. In my view, China has shifted the status quo in its favor in recent years by building military outposts, using them to resupply gray holes and white holes so that they can operate 24/7 and exert control over activities in the waters of the South China Sea. So this is a challenge for the Biden administration going forward. From my perspective, US interests go beyond the preservation of freedom of navigation. That is necessary, but it's not sufficient. US interests include peaceful resolution of disputes, the maintenance of a rules-based order founded on international law that protects the interests of all states, large and small. So I think US military presence operations will continue. We just saw the Theodore Roosevelt carrier battle group enter the South China Sea today or yesterday. B-52s are operating there as we speak. Again, I'm not sure if things are sort of on automatic pilot from the Trump administration, but I do think that these kinds of presence operations and demonstrations of US resolve will continue. China, of course, wants to address the territorial disputes bilaterally with individual claimants, sign probably a toothless code of conduct with ASEAN, and its South China Sea policy suggests a larger push to dilute US influence in the region. So this is one of the reasons why I think it will remain a fraught issue. Finally, I would say that President Biden believes that that steady US engagement and presence in the Asia Pacific has stabilized the region, that it's created economic opportunity, it's fostered good governance. And so I think that he will support very active engagement in the region diplomatically. China, I think, will not welcome a more active, engaged United States on its periphery. So I expect that friction will continue. But that friction can be managed with the right kind of policies and the right kind of dialogue mechanisms. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Tom. Back to you.
Thank you, Daniel. I was locked. My mute button was locked by my co-host, Daniel. So thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Andy. I wanted to say something about Biden administration policy as I see it now and where I think it's heading. And I just wanted to start with some of the people and say how experienced they are. We have some really sharp observers of Asian politics with a lot of experience. And at the top of the list is Kurt Campbell, who's going to be the so-called Asia czar at the White House with a status like Deputy National Security Advisor, I gather. He's worked at the Pentagon. He was Assistant Secretary of State in the Obama administration. He has a real wealth of knowledge of the region. His China person underneath him is Laura Rosenberger, someone who was on my team at the State Department during the Bush administration, working on some sensitive issues like North Korean refugees. She's very experienced. She worked in the NSC during the Obama administration, and she's going in as the senior China director. At the Pentagon, there's Eli Ratner, and Eli was at a major think tank as a vice president for years, but he was also the Deputy National Security Advisor for then Vice President Biden. So he has quite a bit of government experience. And Bonnie mentioned Julian Gewirtz, and we're proud of him at the China in the World program. He's a current fellow this year. We had to give him leave so he could go be China director at the National Security Council. He's worked at the Department of Energy before. I'm not really sure who's going to be the ambassador out in Beijing. We don't know that yet, or at least I don't. But there's rumor that the Assistant Secretary of State at East Asian Pacific Affairs will be an experienced Foreign Service officer. And that will be a big plus for the administration. In terms of strategy, which I think flows from some of the experience of these individuals, I think there's going to be a heavy emphasis, and they've said this in their writings recently and in their public statements, heavy emphasis on rebuilding U.S. alliances and partnerships in the region. The strength of those alliances and partnerships are really the greatest advantage that the United States has in a strategic competition with China. The U.S. has some 60 plus alliances and security relationships with countries around the world, and China has very few formal such relationships. And those relationships have suffered quite a bit in the last 4 years as the Trump administration put tremendous pressure not just on China, but also on our allies on issues like trade, burden sharing, et cetera. So I expect there to be less intense pressure on those issues by the Biden administration. And I think the Biden administration will also try to rebuild U.S. reputation in multilateral organizations, which is an area where the United States traditionally has been a major influential actor. But in recent years, China has really moved into a vacuum in multilateral organizations left by the United States because the Trump administration didn't really like multilateral diplomacy very much. And I believe that the United States can assert itself more effectively on humanitarian issues as well in the Biden administration, along the lines that Andy referred to earlier, and gain some U.S. diplomatic prestige and power in that realm. In addition to building up security alliances, I think the Biden administration also intends, judging from recent publications by officials in the Biden administration. They plan on building up the capacity of local actors to resist Chinese pressure. Some of the pressure that Bonnie laid out so well in the gray zone areas elsewhere in the South China Sea. Let them have the intelligence wherewithal to know what's happening and some of the capabilities necessary to counter some of those Chinese activities. There's one big problem though, and I don't know how it's going to play out. I think there's a kind of tension in the Biden administration's approach to international relations that will make some of this strategy somewhat more complex. And that is that the US really needs a major economic component to its diplomacy in East Asia in order to strengthen those relationships with Asian states, both allies, partners, and neutral states. And in Asia, there's been a big advance in multilateral economic diplomacy in the last few years. So there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US negotiated in the Obama administration, was scrapped by President Trump in 2017. The US participation was scrapped. That went ahead, and it's now the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a long name, but it includes the other 11 countries in that agreement, and a lot of those are our closest friends in the region. It'll be really interesting to see if the US can re-enter those negotiations, but the Biden administration has signaled a kind of traditional Democratic Party view on multilateral trade and economics that suggests that they're going to be very cautious about making new agreements that open up US markets to outside products. And Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, had published some things, and he just yesterday made another statement that suggests he's somewhat wary of agreements like the TPP, which ease investment across borders. And the argument that he made is that we need agreements that don't just help American investment banks and pharmaceutical companies. We need trade agreements that help workers. Personally, I think that's a kind of a false choice, but it's a very common argument in the trade world from that perspective. And then there's going to be a big question. If you're not willing to go into the TPP, then how can you really build those strong relationships with those 11 actors? If you do it, how are you going to square that with these arguments? And there's a technical argument that we can talk about in the Q&A if someone wants to, how the pharmaceutical piece can actually help the United States get back in the TPP, because that was a major stumbling block for American negotiations in the TPP back in the Obama administration, the insistence of American pharmaceutical companies to have their intellectual property protected for a very long time. So maybe that signals a possibility for the US to get back involved in that. On the other side, yesterday, the Biden administration put out a statement about Made in America and government procurement, which suggests that they may be more protectionist on various things, trying to make sure the United States is more self-reliant in the production of various goods. There'll also be cooperation alongside competition, and we really have no choice on this matter. It's an interdependent, globalized world, that's just a fact. And there are various global issues like climate change, like pandemics, like nuclear nonproliferation, where the United States really has no choice but to ask for Chinese cooperation. Look at something like nonproliferation. The two countries in question, Iran and North Korea, are the concern, and China is by far the biggest economic partner of both of those countries. So if you want to put pressure on those countries, you're going to have to cooperate with China or seek cooperation from China on those issues. And even the Trump administration, which was kind of in a full court press on China, especially in the last 2 years, still would recognize after all that pressure, they would say, oh, but of course we're going to seek cooperation on a couple of things. They wouldn't talk about climate change, obviously, but on non-proliferation, et cetera. And that won't be different for the Biden administration. They really need to seek China's cooperation on some of these issues. So they're going to have to pitch diplomatically their competition with China in a way that doesn't constantly pressure China, pressure the regime at home, and then at the end of the day say, oh, and by the way, we still need your help on X, Y, or Z. There's going to have to be something more subtle, and I think the people I described before are quite capable of that. And one of the big advantages that they have is multilateralism. One of the big advantages that the Biden administration is going to have in its foreign policy towards the region and towards China over the Trump administration is they really believe in multilateralism. And that's going to be particularly convenient right now when we're seeking cooperation with China on some of these global issues, because the multilateral organizations provide an opportunity for the United States and China to cooperate on issues without having high-level bilateral diplomacy that would be criticized both in the United States and in China itself in the current political environment. So if you're cooperating on pandemics through the World Health Organization, which the US is rejoining, then you're not just sitting down with China and talking about COVID with all the explosive domestic political implications on both sides of the Pacific. And I think that that's a big advantage. I think the United States can cooperate with China in the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, which is going to be very important as the economic implications of the pandemic hit the developing world. It's almost inevitable. At the WTO, which I hope the United States will rejoin in a serious way and stop violating the rules of, and also enable to do things like appeal rulings and arbitration, appeal rulings and adjudication in the future. The Trump administration not only violated the WTO rules by my estimation, they also made it very hard for the WTO as an organization to function because they blocked the hiring of new judges. So I think that's a big advantage, but there are these pressing problems, and I wanted to come full circle back to Andy's discussion. And one of these things, you study history and you realize timetables and dates are really important, and they're often arbitrary, and they're often hard to predict when you just look at the politics of various countries. One of the timetables Bonnie mentioned in her excellent presentation, which is the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. The party wants to achieve things on the occasion of the 100th anniversary. But another one is just maybe dumb luck, the 2022 Winter Olympics. It's a big issue. The 2022 Winter Olympics is a big issue. So there are huge human rights violations in China, in Xinjiang. There's suppression of democracy in Hong Kong. This makes China very unpopular around the world. It's not just in the United States. The public opinion polls suggest China's popularity around the world is about as low as it's been in the reform era. And you have a Winter Olympics coming up. On top of that, you have the Trump administration labeling what's going on in Xinjiang as a genocide. And it appears so far that Biden administration officials have accepted that label. So it's quite easy to imagine a US boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics. And if that happens, it'll have huge implications for the bilateral relationship that are totally separate from the economic issues I raised, and the economic issues are shared by many other US partners on intellectual property rights protection, access to markets, subsidies of state-owned enterprises as unfair practices. All that stuff is shared, but this will be a very, very tense thing that just comes around because China secured the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics, and then we have these other tense issues related to humanitarian affairs, and it's not going to go away. And I expect it to become an increasingly frequently discussed issue in the U.S.-China relationship as we move closer to those Olympics. And I'll just stop there, and we have plenty of time for questions. Thanks to the other two panelists, and we really look forward to the questions from the audience. Turn it over to Daniel to try to choose a few of them.
Thanks, Tom. Let's start off from Mark Kramer from Harvard University, professor, who asks, given that China has never complied with the WTO's rules on market access, intellectual property rights, and other matters, is there any prospect that the Biden administration will seek to have China expelled from the WTO? I don't know who wants to take that, but.
I could take it. I don't think China's record in terms of the letter of the WTO is as bad as was described in the beginning of the question. China tends to work around the WTO agreements, and that's why we need a reformed WTO to cover some of the more basic realities of a globalized transnational production chain with China in it. But there have been violations, and China's been called out on them, and China has lost some suits. China has also sued the United States at the WTO. So my view of the WTO is it's basically a good thing, the WTO, and it's basically a good thing that China was in it. And I don't have time to go into all the details of why that's a good thing. But the WTO is insufficient for the 21st century and needs to be reformed upward. And the problem recently has been China has been very conservative in the WTO. There's a good article in the Wall Street Journal today about this, not allowing reform of the WTO. And the United States, frankly, for the last 4 years has just attacked the WTO. It's attacked its own commitments at the WTO, and it has attacked the WTO as an organization by preventing those judges from being replaced that are essential to the appeals process. So the US stops attacking it and tries to reform it, the US might be able to link up with the European Union, which is also pro-reform, and convince China to move forward. And all things being equal, the bilateral investment treaty with the EU might actually help push China in that direction. So we'll see how the Biden administration tackles that. But they have to believe in trade, the Biden administration, to really push this. They have to believe that that's a good thing, that globalization is a good thing and trade is a good thing. I believe they both are, as I'm suggesting, but the U.S. has to believe in it if it's going to press it.
Anyone else want to take a stab at that?
I would just add to that. I completely agree with everything that Tom said. When the WTO was created, there was not an anticipation that China would emerge to be this very, very large state-run economy, giving subsidies to Chinese companies. And so there's a lot of gray areas in the WTO. There's also no regulations or rules for new areas like the digital economy that has, of course, emerged. So there's a pressing need to update the WTO and to make it capable of responding to the challenges that China poses. That said, there's likely to be cases that China will bring against the United States. They've already won one of those cases against the Trump tariffs, and they're likely to win more. So the United States hasn't done a very good job of being consistent with WTO policies in recent years either. So I do hope that the United States, the EU, and other countries can update the WTO so that it addresses the problems that are present and will hopefully restrict China from using some of its forced technology practices and stealing of intellectual property, et cetera, going forward. But it's not surprising that an international organization needs to be updated from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
Andy, you want to jump in on that, or
No,
move on to the
not
next question?
necessary. No.
Okay. Another question from Martin Flaherty from Fordham University, professor. What steps or policies should the Biden administration undertake to deal with human rights and violations in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Tibet, and China itself? And are there spaces left for engagement to promote rights and the rule of law within China, as was the conventional wisdom before Xi Jinping?
Well, I'll just say hi, Marty, and turn it over to Andy, because he's
Hi,
our
Marty.
human rights expert.
Yeah. We first is the multilateral piece that has been, Tom has mentioned, and working with the allies on this, getting all together. Second one is rejoining the relevant international institutions like the Human Rights Council. Third is calling them out on these things. Fourth is giving support to those outside of China who are fighting this, like the Uyghur Human Rights Project in Washington, D.C. and so forth. All of these measures together are not really going to move the dial in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet, because the Chinese government has really existential security reasons for cracking down in these places. They've chosen the strategy of crackdown rather than a strategy of accommodation or multiculturalism or something, and they're stuck on that track. So they're not going to give it up, but it's important for us to continue to keep the pressure on. Tom mentioned that these things are making China's other foreign policy objectives much more difficult to achieve. In terms of engagement, it has become really dangerous. Well, the Chinese government, as Marty and others know, has instituted strict regulations for the operation of foreign non-governmental organizations inside of China. So some of the foundations are there, but there isn't, what they can do is very limited. It's always been the case that Ford and the Asia Foundation and so forth operating in China have to operate with partners approved by the Chinese government. But in terms of working with human rights lawyers, feminists, people like that, religious activists, it's really dangerous for those people. There are some small ways it can be done in terms of remote training and things like that, but it's engagement in the classic old sense of working with sort of Chinese establishment persons to try to quote unquote socialize them to the advantages of international law and human rights. I think that strategy, for the time being, the Chinese government has blocked it.
One more, Daniel.
Next one from Yingfeng Ji, is a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge. As China further implements its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative and further strengthens its relationship with related developing states, to what extent do you think the Biden administration will confront or approach China in these expanding areas?
Bonnie, you want to go? I'll go. I have something to say about it, but I want to offer our guest to the first shot if she wants it.
You can go ahead, and I'll piggyback on your response.
Here's what I expect. I don't know how they're going to handle it, but I expect a pullback from some of the least productive posturing of the Trump administration, in my own opinion, which was to label all of China's foreign economic policy as predatory. And to claim that almost all of the loans that China was giving around the world were parts of something called debt trap diplomacy. It was not, the debt trap diplomacy label was not accurate, first of all. And the idea that all of China's foreign economic policy was predatory was very bad diplomacy. I traveled around Southeast Asia in late 2019, multiple countries. And it's not surprising that you have a bunch of post-colonial nationalist countries that didn't really appreciate American diplomats coming and telling them that they were prey to Chinese lenders, that they were dupes of China. So what I hope the Biden administration will do, and I guess I expect it because I think that these people are experienced, is that they will move to a more subtle approach, which is to say, we really would like to see more transparency in the loans that are involved in the BRI without judging upfront whether they're all terrible, predatory, and awful and harmful to the world, and that there ought to be more international cooperation in those projects. So maybe more of the money should go through an organization like the AAIB, which has rules and is multilateral, and less of it through bilateral shady deals, or maybe those bilateral deals could be less shady and more transparent. And I also hope, but this is I'm a little bit more doubtful because of domestic politics in the United States, that the US will do more than whine about Chinese influence that's gained through development activities in infrastructure activities in the developing world, and actually get in the game and actually try to provide some services to developing countries that that make the United States look attractive. And that could be a non-zero sum competition that would be not only good for the United States, but good for the developing countries and good for China. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum competition. If China gains influence through good loans that are relatively transparent, and the US develops a good reputation through something else, maybe in the tech sphere, then the developing countries win from that competition, and it doesn't actually hurt everybody. So that's where I hope it comes out. I found very damaging for US power in East Asia the narrative that the Trump administration adopted about China's foreign economic policy. It seemed removed from reality, and it seemed insulting to the countries that we were trying to win over in this actual great power competition that we're in with China.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I agree with, again, all that, Tom. I think that there is an effort that had gotten underway in the Trump administration to try to provide an alternative, increase the amount of money that was available to OPIC, and now under this new international aid organization, and the first ever U.S.-Japan project now being built in Palau. A little slow getting out of the box, but there is potential there. Japan obviously invests a great deal around the Indo-Pacific region. We can work more with Australia. But the focus, I think, in the Biden administration will rightfully be on the more positive things that we can do and try to engage with other countries. And that we're not going to be a big aid-giving country. We're not going to have the resources that China has to throw at the problem of infrastructure. But if China can produce some good solutions, I think that the Biden administration will be supportive of those solutions. Where countries maybe need help negotiating on loans with China, maybe that's an area where European countries can provide some added value to give advice on how to negotiate good loans, because China's development bank, may not be taking other countries' interests into account in the way that they should, in the way that like the World Bank would, looking at their bottom lines and how heavy their debt currently is. So my concern is that, as you mentioned earlier, Tom, is with the low priority so far being accorded to trade, I worry that the economic pillar of our Indo-Pacific strategy, we probably won't call it the pivot or the rebalance. My guess is we won't call it the free and open Indo-Pacific. But as a president-elect,
we can have a naming contest.
Well, Biden, before he was, actually it was after he was elected, but before he was inaugurated, had many phone calls with Indo-Pacific leaders in which he used the phrase secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific. So I don't know if we want to call that SPIP. It doesn't ring too well to the ears. But anyway, I think there will be something, and I hope that we will have a strong economic pillar.
Yeah, just let me say, I agree with you about the BUILD Act and the OPIC. It was one of the things the Trump administration did right, at least as an optic. Like, we're not just going to complain, we're going to try to compete, but it's only in its infant stages. Let's hope that carries forward.
All right. So another question comes from Nikolai Anderson, PhD fellow in political science at Aarhus University. I may have pronounced that incorrectly. So is there really any chance that the United States and European pressure for improvement to human rights in China will have any success? I'm assuming this is in part based off the current China-EU investment deal that was just signed and concerns that the Biden administration had.
Yeah, I missed the word. Any chance that US and EU pressure, what was the word?
Is there any chance that the United States and European pressure will improve human rights issues in China?
Well, I think not in the near term. I mean, I think it's important, human rights improvements are by nature discontinuous, right? So pressure continues for a long, long time, and then something happens. You never know when. I think in the near-term future, the Chinese government under Xi Jinping is convinced that its security depends upon the tight security, the crackdown type of attitude that it's taking, and it's not going to. So back in the quote-unquote good old days, after Tiananmen, when the U.S. was, for example, was threatening to cancel most favored nation trading privileges with China unless certain human rights improvements were made. There were a short number of years in which the Chinese would dribble out a few concessions, release some political prisoner, Wei Jingsheng, to come overseas and so forth. It didn't make structural change in China, but the Chinese government was trying to manage the situation. Those days are gone. They will respond angrily and push back against US and EU pressure. Say, if, as Tom said, if there's a boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics, the Chinese government will respond angrily, but you won't, I don't believe you're going to see a release of prisoners or a change in the strategy in Xinjiang in the near term. But if you imagine us giving up and dropping that pressure and saying, okay, nothing's going to change, we give up, that would send just such a bad signal in so many ways. Would not, not be a wise thing to do. And I think as one continues to stand up for one's own side, one's own values. And by the way, with respect to the Belt and Road, one of the things that we can provide inexpensively to these many countries is educational exchange. And the same thing is true for China, that we used to have, and I'm not sure what the number is now, some 300,000 Chinese students in the United States. This is an enormous strategic asset that the Trump administration interfered with, partly because of the COVID, but also over concern about the security issue. This is something we need to continue to have. And that kind of thing, the continued articulation of the international human rights standards by the US and the EU, in the long run, we don't know when, we don't know how, will be very important. So I think we need to keep it up.
Anyone else before the next question? No. This one's from Sasha Chabra, who's a recent Columbia University master's student graduate, who asks, the Trump era saw a very boisterous Taiwan policy that was embraced vociferously by the Taiwanese public, most of whom were sad to see Trump lose, although Trump's policies were more aimed at using Taiwan as a clutch against China rather than actually defending Taiwan's democracy. There's a very real fear among Taiwanese that Biden will move the relationship backwards and avoid supporting Taiwanese sovereignty despite the obvious pro-democracy agenda President Biden has articulated. How can the Biden administration move forward pro-Taiwan policy that defends Taiwanese democracy and sovereignty without a return to an appeasement era?
So I'll start with that. Tom,
yeah, please, Bonnie. Okay? No, please.
I think the questioner has it right in the description of many members of the public in Taiwan. I think there was actually a lack of appreciation among the general public in Taiwan that there was always a risk that President Trump was going to throw Taiwan under the bus. That, if Xi Jinping had actually asked President Trump to stop selling arms to Taiwan in return for something Trump wanted, that kind of danger was always out there. And frankly, I think that Taiwan dodged a bullet in the Trump administration. It paid a cost for some of the things that were done, but that was perhaps even anticipated, and they decided to incur that cost. And for example, I would say the fact that China is now, as I referenced earlier, flying these military aircraft around Taiwan constantly and across the center line, which it had not done for 20 years. This is a cost that Taiwan is paying. It's a threat to its security. It's a pressure on their pilots and the maintenance crews and on their defense budget. So there were some negative impacts. But the Biden administration, I think, is going to be quite strategic about Taiwan. I think, as Tom mentioned earlier, Kurt Campbell is going to be the coordinator for the Indo-Pacific in the National Security Council. And he has deep experience with Taiwan and has thought a great deal, I think, about what the United States should and should not do. A lot of the steps that the Trump administration took, I think, will just go back to being done in a low profile way. So for example, the United States conducts naval transits through the Taiwan Strait. We did that in prior administrations. The Trump administration has just announced everyone publicly. They've also leaked secret military exercises that we do with Taiwan, or announce dialogues that we've always done with Taiwan, but we just didn't put on the front pages of newspapers. So all of these things will continue, but they won't be used as a cudgel against Beijing. There will be, I think, high-level officials that will travel from both sides, but probably for meaningful reasons, not for symbolic reasons. I think it's a big question mark as to whether or not there will be bilateral trade talks. Again, going back to questions about whether trade is going to be a high priority for the Biden administration, and particularly trade agreements. That just seems unlikely. Maybe in the later years there would be consideration of a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan, but I don't think it's going to happen in the first year. There's other things we can do with Taiwan. Cooperation on supply chain resiliency is extremely important because Taiwan's role in semiconductors and other IT areas is really crucial for the United States. So I think it's a matter of shaping a policy that shows resolve, reassures Taiwan, but also tells Taiwan, you have your own role to play in defending yourself. Please don't just sit back and expect us to come rescue you all the time. You have to do more to strengthen deterrence yourself. And then there is a role for both, not only deterrence of China, but also reassurance. And I think that the Biden administration will perhaps seek to pursue a somewhat more consistent policy so that China doesn't the Chinese and Xi Jinping don't wake up every morning and think, wow, maybe today is the day the Secretary of State is just going to show up in Taiwan, or the United States will declare the establishment of diplomatic relations with the Republic of China. Yeah. So I think there will be limits, and if China accepts that there are limits, and even though it won't like the US policy of selling arms and having these meetings and dialogues with Taiwan, but I think that we can get it back to a place where China can tolerate it, and the United States still is a firm supporter of Taiwan's security and prosperity. So I think that's doable. I don't think it's really all that difficult. But Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with everything Bonnie said, especially on Taiwan issues. That there tends to be a pattern there. I just add a couple of things. The question ended with, will we return to the policy of appeasement? And that's why I kind of smiled at the end of the question. I think the U.S. policy towards cross-strait relations has been fantastically successful from a historical perspective. Fantastically successful. The idea that there hasn't been conflict military conflict of some scope across the Taiwan Strait is a remarkable success. And the reason that it's a remarkable success is that it hasn't been a policy of appeasement. It's been a very smart policy of credible threats of intervention if the mainland uses military force to try to force unification against Taiwan's will, and combined with a credible reassurance that the purpose of all that is not to recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state and thereby unnecessarily provoke attacks from the mainland. And that's been the policy for a long time. I think that will be the Biden administration's policy. And I think it will be better for Taiwan in the sense that I think the people that we discussed earlier understand Taiwan's security needs, and Taiwan is on a good trajectory on that score in terms of taking the real risks, the real threats that they face seriously, and making adjustments in their own military strategy towards the mainland with the help of the United States. I think that will continue. And I think that President Tsai has been the real factor here. She has been a terrific leader in my estimation, because she has understood those challenges that Taiwan faces, cooperated with the United States in order to meet those challenges, but she has been very moderate politically. She has not jabbed the mainland in the eye with pro-independence initiatives, and I think that will continue, and these people will work well with President Tsai moving forward. And the last thing is this thing about using Taiwan as a stick, which is not good for Taiwan. In other words, the United States has various ways to punish China, but if it tries to use Taiwan to punish China rather than to support Taiwan for what it is and bolster it, Taiwan is the one that's going to get hurt. There's a long history going back to the 1950s of the US using third parties as a stick against China. Those sticks tend to break.
I would like to add that in the long run, it depends on the credibility of the American military deterrent to China. And as far as I know, that position has deteriorated a great deal. The Chinese position has improved. When the time comes when neither China nor Taiwan really believes that the American military has the capability or the will to defend, to prevent an armed takeover of Taiwan, then all of the posturing and diplomacy won't really control the situation.
I guess I'm more hopeful, Andy, on that score, in that what the United States and Taiwan in combination have to present to the mainland is the idea that there is no acceptably inexpensive way for them to solve this problem militarily. It doesn't have to be overwhelming superiority in every case. And at the same time, that there's no political reason for the mainland to use force on any given day. And that's the reassurance part. And that's not appeasement, that's just standard deterrence, which involves two elements: a credible threat, a punishment if prohibited behavior is adopted, and a credible assurance that that threat is conditional on the behavior of the target, that they won't have their cookie jar taken away no matter what happens. So the United States has been very successful, remarkably successful from a diplomatic historical perspective in balancing those two things in a way that had preserved the miracle that is Taiwan, which is a wealthy, free society that's been under constant pressure from across the Taiwan Strait.
So a similar question comes from a Columbia University senior who did not want to be named, who's asking about Hong Kong. How can the Biden administration pressure China on the Hong Kong issue in addition to sanctioning local officials?
Well, it's the same really answer that I gave before. Point out what's going on there, use the UN institutions to point that out. The UN special rapporteurs, a sub-institution within the UN Human Rights Council, they've been articulate on this, on this issue. And I think also something I didn't mention before, but it applies to Hong Kong and other human rights people, is asylum, to allow those who can get out to settle down out here. We don't really have leverage over Beijing in terms of making them change their behavior on issues where they feel their existential interests are involved. And of course, the behavior of the expat business community in Hong Kong, which our government doesn't control, will send a signal if they feel unsafe and get out. But again, that won't change the behavior of Beijing and Hong Kong. They've made their decision that they have to completely squelch all independent activity, political activity there, and they're not going to change.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that before the next question? Okay. So the next question is from Peter Clement, a professor at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. To what extent, if any, would Xi use expansion of existing ties to Russia as a card in countering any perceived US pressure via its strengthened relationship with its Asian partners?
So I'll start on that by saying that I don't think that Xi Jinping views the relationship with Russia as something to use as a card. I believe that the Chinese have what they consider to be an important relationship with Russia because they share some common goals. That doesn't mean, of course, that their goals are coincident on every issue, and there are clear differences between them on many things, but they have really, in my view, demonstrated an uncanny ability to compartmentalize differences and work together to try and weaken the U.S. in the international system, in some ways undermine the international order. They work together at the UN on issues like internet governance, and they've taken each other's positions where they're not vital of interests for one side, but basically China will support Russia on something like Syria because it's not that important to China, and then Russia will go ahead and support China on something that maybe isn't a front burner issue for Moscow. So this is a relationship that I think is becoming more strategic. There's more military cooperation going on now, development of early warning radar together. And so I think that it is significant, and it has been maybe even gotten closer as a result of Trump administration policies. And so I think that this should be of concern to the Biden administration. And one question is, should we develop a policy that is aimed at trying to drive a wedge between the two, or at least not driving them together to be working at cross purposes to American interests? But I don't think that this is just a card for Xi Jinping. I think it's something that has greater strategic value.
Yeah, I don't. Peter's not with us anymore. I think he had to leave. He sent me a message, but just on the same theme, I think that the Russia-China relationship is more than just a balance of power relationship against a superior United States. I think it is based in the two capitals' mutual distrust along the lines that Andy laid out so well in his comments, that the United States is all about undermining authoritarianism and spreading democracy and color revolutions. They don't like that in third countries. They didn't like it in Eastern Europe, and they didn't like it in Syria and places like that. But they certainly don't like it when it's aimed at their capitals. But I do think there's a difference between the two, and one is that Russia has very actively tried to undermine democracy in Eastern Europe. And I agree with Andy that China has been much more defensive in its influence operations, trying to get other countries not to criticize the Chinese Communist Party or not to get involved in the sovereignty disputes on the side of the other disputants. It hasn't really tried to undermine democracy as an institution in other places. So I don't think they have the same ideological take on that score. But I had to say that if I had to do a prediction, I think that Russia-China relations may get closer in the early part of the Biden administration, because I expect a partial principled position by the Biden administration of being more critical of Putin's regime in Russia than the Trump administration was. And I also expect a little bit of emotional payback for the failed Hillary Clinton campaign, on which many of the people who worked in the Biden administration worked very hard in 2016 and sincerely believe the Russians stole from them. It's really hard. That's a visceral thing. So if that's the case, and there's more criticism of Putin on domestic ideological grounds, I think that's the real glue in the China-Russia relationship. And we already have the Xinjiang and Hong Kong issues that are going to lead to criticism of Beijing's rule at home. And I think that will, in the near term, lead to a tighter relations. But I do believe that Russia and China are natural competitors in places like Central Asia, and that over time, those competitions will come out. And I don't get the impression that Putin and the Russians really like being a junior partner to China. And China is kind of portraying itself as the senior partner in that relationship.
Yeah, actually, Tom, I think that Xi Jinping has gone out of his way from day one to not treat Putin as a junior partner. He's been very successful in giving him respect and face that I think is very well, much appreciated by Putin. So yes, Russia doesn't want to be a junior partner, but I think Xi Jinping knows that and therefore doesn't treat him as such. On the issue of disinformation, I guess I would like to maybe just express a different point of view, that there isn't a clear distinction between just being sort of defensive and protecting China's interests and harming the interests of others, including the United States. And I would cite one example where there is clear evidence that China is pushing a narrative through disinformation in the United States that the vaccines that have been developed and deployed for the Americans are killing people and therefore are risky. And so maybe Americans shouldn't take this vaccine. And this is absolutely against the scientific facts that are out there. But I think it's because China sees the United States as mired in the pandemic, sees advantages for China in this, and hopes that they can prolong it. And I'm sorry to say that there's evidence that this is the case. So I'm a bit more worried about Chinese disinformation than you are.
Oh no! Let me be clear. I think the disinformation campaigns and the influence in universities and the media are very corrosive. I think they're definitely, we need to be vigilant about them. I just don't know what the purpose of them are. I don't believe that they're to undermine democracy. In the case of COVID, China has a huge domestic reason to sell itself as the COVID champion and the U.S. as the COVID loser. And the U.S. government used a lot of pressure on China about COVID and blamed China for the COVID pandemic around the world. So you had a situation where that kind of behavior, which I think is reprehensible to spread misinformation about COVID, it can also be put into that framework of this is the Chinese Communist Party trying to say, we have a legitimate system, we handle the thing well, stop criticizing us for this global pandemic. They lost a lot of diplomatic points on these Pew scales around the world because of COVID. So it doesn't surprise me that they're lashing out in that way. But I think it's very different from Russia undermining democratic elections in the Baltics. That's all my point. I'm not saying it's not serious. It's very serious. The issue is very serious.
There's a question from Keith Se, who I believe is the executive director at the China Technological Industry Group, who's asked a question about recoupling. Will the Biden administration seek to recouple with China and end the trade war? And if they do, what does a recouple look like?
Okay, so the trade issue, I'll start with the trade issue. I don't expect a lot of the tariffs to be lifted quickly that have been raised. There were sweeping tariffs that were clearly in violation, in my opinion, of our WTO obligations, and the WTO recently, as Bonnie said, ruled in that direction. But I don't expect them to get removed right away for a few reasons. One is all of the stuff we're discussing today, we have to keep this in context, and no one said it yet, but I'll say it now. This is the beginning of the Biden administration. They are primarily focused on domestic issues. They have a pandemic. They have an economic crisis. They have social justice issues on their plate. They are concerned about climate change, but they're focused on domestic aspects of that. So there's a lot of domestic issues that are really going to dominate. So to get rid of the trade tariffs that are in existence takes attention and bandwidth. That's probably not going to be there very early on in the administration. In addition, the trade tariffs themselves, in my view, were not the problem in the Trump administration's approach. If the trade tariffs had been raised as leverage in order to open up new agreements that would make the two economies more integrated in the end, then that would have been a clever approach to the problem, to say, you know, we'll end the punishment when you handle some of these problems. And I suspect the Biden administration will see the tariffs as leverage for those types of negotiations. But at the end of the day, there are certain areas of our economies that are not going to recouple. I don't think we're going to recouple on 5G. I don't think we're going to recouple on artificial intelligence. And we're not going to recouple on a lot of high-tech issues that impact the military areas. But in general, I can see a process that will take quite a bit of time working its way out, where we have more normal trade and economic negotiations with China without these sweeping 25% across the board tariffs in place.
Another question from Thomas A. Breslin, who's a professor at Florida International University. Years ago, when I was briefed by the Taiwan military, the point was made that the Taiwanese that Japan would assist in protecting Taiwan. Is that still a part of Taiwan military thinking today?
I think that if you speak to military officers from Taiwan, they will generally talk more about the role of the United States. They have contact with Japan's retired military officers. They don't have as much dialogue, of course, with active military officers in Japan. But I think that there is a growing expectation, and frankly, not just in Taiwan, but many countries, that Japan would get involved if there were a military conflict that the United States was involved in. And this is all contingency dependent, and there are many roles that Japan could play. It is, I think, extremely unlikely if the United States is not involved that Japan would be involved, so we can rule out that. But Japan could be involved in the provision of supplies, logistics, and a lot of ways that it could support an action in the Taiwan Strait, just as Japan's assistance and involvement would be very critical in a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And so these are actually subjects that are discussed in far greater detail now over the last few years between the US and Japan than ever before. You know, in years past, probably around when, you know, Tom, you were in the administration, I think there was far less discussion between the US and Japan in very concrete terms about what could be done. From what I hear from people who have worked in the Pentagon and at Indo-Pacific Command more recently under the Trump administration, there is a very active discussion about Taiwan, though I don't think it has been elevated to joint planning by any means, but there's quite a bit of discussion about various contingencies and the role that that Japan might play, both in peacetime and in a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. So I don't know specifically about Taiwanese military expectations of Japan's involvement, but they wouldn't be completely wrong to anticipate that Japan might be engaged in some way, because it is a certainty that Japan sees its security as affected by what happens to Taiwan and whether it is taken over by the People's Republic of China. So this would pose a critical threat to Japan's supply lines. And so I think that they see Taiwan as even more strategically important for their interests than perhaps the United States does.
Yeah, I just there's a limit to what I can talk about and on these types of topics, but I can speak abstractly and say the points that I would reiterate from Bonnie is that it's really impossible to imagine Japan coming to Taiwan's defense without the United States. But it might be said as well that it's really difficult to imagine the United States defending Taiwan in a persistent fashion without a degree of Japanese cooperation, because the US would be using bases in Japan and logistics in Japan. Even in those circumstances, though, it's a bit of a leap to imagine Japanese frontline forces in the conflict. But their participation of Japan in a prolonged conflict involving the United States is essential because of the distance of Taiwan from the United States, the large basing posture of the United States in Japan. And that's been discussed for a very long time, and it's being discussed more robustly now. Why? Because of the reasons that Andy laid out so well. China has so many more military options against Taiwan, and Taiwan is no further away from the mainland than it was before. So it's harder and harder to defend Taiwan from a military kinetic point of view. So things need to be rethought. And when you're in an alliance relationship on whom you rely, the United States, in terms of intervention, you have to talk about the new options that you're considering in those contingencies with your allies. So it doesn't surprise me that discussions may have a higher tempo than they have in the past. But it's going back to the Clinton administration. Japan has been considered critically important, at least as a non-veto player, not blocking the US from its actions in both a future contingency in Taiwan and also on the Korean Peninsula, as Bonnie laid out so well.
But I think we might be giving a bit too affirmative an answer to the question, although because you made it rather subtle, but the Japanese will not fight in such a war, and they're very allergic to being dragged into a situation by the United States. The US wants to fight, and it wants to use Japanese facilities and intel and logistics and bases, but the Japanese don't want to be used and not have any control over it.
Right. And I would add, Andy, that the United States shouldn't want Japan to play those roles.
True, but
if you ever want to unwind this thing, if there's a conflict and you want to unwind it, having Japanese fighting forces in a Taiwan contingency is an utter disaster for all the historical reasons that we all know.
so
It would be a disaster.
the person who raised the question was being told by Taiwanese officers that you know Japanese ships and planes would be in the battle.
Yeah.
I don't think that's correct.
Yeah. I'm surprised that they told him that, but it's interesting.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have today. I want to make sure we give any concluding remarks to the three panelists before we sort of conclude for the evening. Anything we missed? Anything?
I see some. Yeah, I just see a question about personnel at the end from Yang Ye, insider professional. Matt Pottinger has a lot of experience in China. That's correct. Yu Mao Chun has been studying China his whole life, so it wasn't a question of experience. And I think I laid out at the beginning that the Biden administration has highly experienced people. It's not there's no deficit of experience in dealing with East Asia. The people I listed, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more that will be rolled out. And I just wanted to give one more shout out to my China in the World Fellow, Julian Gewirtz, who's stepping into a very senior position, and I wish him Godspeed. And we're really proud of him. And it's what we do. We do international relations theory and China's foreign policy, but we also do practical policy studies. And those are the three legs of the China in the World program. And eventually I'll be able to tell you of another former fellow who's going to go into the government, but I'm not at liberty to discuss that yet. So we'll be represented in the Biden administration, and we're proud of our people.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time today. I've posted a link to our website in the chat box in case anyone wants to sign up for our newsletter. Our next event isn't until March 15th with Tabitha Grace Mallory from the University of Washington, but we may have something in the interim. So feel free to sign up to our newsletter and we'll get all the information out to you. But once again, thank you everyone to all of our panelists and for a great discussion, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks, Tom and Andy.